And Mr. President, I rise today to talk about our efforts to change the Senate rules. As we began the 113th Congress on January 3rd, Senators Merkley, Harkin, and I introduced a resolution to reform the standing rules of the Senate. 13 of my colleagues have signed on to co-sponsor our resolution. When we introduced the resolution, we agreed with the majority leader that it would be best to have the debate about reforming our rules after the inauguration. I appreciate his willingness to work with us on this important issue. And although we postponed the debate, we preserved the right of a simple majority of this body to amend the rules in accordance with Article 1, Section 5 of the Constitution. Senate Resolution 4, our proposal to reform the rules, is simple. It is limited and it is fair. Again, we are not ending the filibuster. We preserve the rights of the minority. Here's what we are proposing: an end to the widespread abuse of silent filibusters. Instead, senators would be required to go to the floor and actually tell the American people why they oppose a bill or nominee in order to maintain a filibuster. Debate on motions to proceed to a bill or to send a bill to conference would be limited to 2 hours. Post-cloture debate on a nominee, other than a justice to the Supreme Court, would be limited to 2 hours, rather than the current limit of 30 hours. These are sensible changes. These are reforms we are willing to live with if we are in the minority. And yet we are warned that these simple reforms will transform the very character of the Senate, will leave the minority without a voice. These arguments are covers for continued abuse of the rules. The reforms we propose are modest. Some would say too modest, but they would discourage the excessive use of filibusters. The minority still has the right to filibuster, but not the right of one senator to do so by simply picking up the phone, by simply making an announcement, and then going out to dinner, or more likely, out to a fundraiser. I've listened carefully to the arguments against these changes by the other side. Let me say again, we are not talking about taking away the rights of the minority. We are not talking about abolishing the right of debate or to filibuster. But there must be change. The abuse of the filibuster and other procedural rules has prevented the U.S. Senate from doing its job. We are no longer the world's greatest deliberative body. In fact, we barely deliberate at all. This does not honor this institution, and it does not serve the American people. For most of our history, the filibuster was used very sparingly. But in recent years, what was rare has become routine. The exception has become the norm. Everything is filibustered, every procedural step of the way, with paralyzing effect. The Senate was meant to cool the process, not send it into a deep freeze. Since the Democratic majority came into the upper chamber in 2007, the Senates of the 110th, 111th, and 112th Congresses have the 3 highest totals of filibusters ever recorded. Lyndon Johnson faced 1 filibuster during his 6 years as Senate Majority Leader. In the same span of time, Harry Reid has faced over 390. Lyndon Johnson, 1, Harry Reid, 390. Legislation is blocked at every turn. The result is not surprising. The Senate of the 112th Congress passed a record low 2.8% of bills introduced. That's a 66% decrease from the last Republican majority in 2005-2006, and a 90% decrease from the high in 1955-56. By every measure, the 112th Congress was the most unproductive Congress in our history. My Republican colleagues have come to the floor and made many impassioned statements in opposition to amending our rules at the beginning of this Congress. They say that the rules can only be changed with a 2/3 supermajority, as the current filibuster rule requires. They argue that any attempt to amend the rules by a simple majority is breaking the rules to change the rules. This is simply not true. The supermajority requirement to change Senate rules is in direct conflict with the U.S. Constitution. Article 1, Section 5 of the Constitution states, each House may determine the rules of its proceedings, punish its members for disorderly behavior, and with the concurrence of 2/3, expel a member. When the framers required a supermajority, they explicitly said so, as they did for expelling a member. On all other matters, such as determining the chamber's rules, a majority requirement is clearly implied. There have been 3 rulings by vice presidents sitting as president of the Senate, where you're sitting today, Mr. President. The vice presidents sitting in that chair, they have ruled on the meaning of Article 1, Section 5. In 1957, Vice President Nixon ruled that, quote, the right of the current majority of the Senate at the beginning of a new Congress to adopt its own rules, stemming as it does from the Constitution itself, cannot be restricted or limited by rules adopted by a majority of a previous Congress, end quote. Vice Presidents Rockefeller, Vice President Humphrey made similar rulings at the beginning of later Congresses. The Constitution is clear, and there is also a long-standing common law principle upheld in the Supreme Court that one legislature cannot bind its successors. Many of my Republican colleagues have made the same argument. For example, in 2003, Senator John Cornyn wrote in a law review article, just as one Congress cannot enact a law that a subsequent Congress could not amend by a majority vote, one Senate cannot enact a rule that a subsequent Senate could not amend by majority vote. Such power, after all, would violate the general common law principle that one parliament cannot bind another. So amending our rules at the beginning of a Congress is not breaking the rules to change the rules. It is reaffirming that the U.S. Constitution is superior to the Senate rules. When there's a conflict between them, we follow the Constitution. Some of my colleagues may believe that the Constitution and using the Constitution in this way would be harmful to the Senate. But there is an alternative. We don't have to reform the rules with only a majority vote. Each time the filibuster rule has been amended in the past, a bipartisan majority of senators was prepared to use the constitutional option. But with a majority vote on the reforms looming, enough members agreed on a compromise, and they passed the changes with 2/3 in favor. We could do that again. I know many of my Republican colleagues agree with me. The Senate is not working. As I visit with my Republican colleagues on the other side of the aisle here, they tell me they're unhappy with the way things are. I said 2 years ago that I would push for the same reforms at the beginning of the next Congress, regardless of which party was in the majority. At the time, many people believed the Democrats would lose their majority. So let me be clear. If Leader McConnell had become the new majority leader in this Congress, I would have asked him to work with me on these same reforms. I will say again, the proposed changes will reform the abuse of the filibuster. They will not trample the legitimate rights of the minority party. I'm willing to live with all of the changes we are proposing, whether I am in the majority or the minority. The other side has suggested that a change in the rules is an affront to the American people. But the real affront would be to allow the abuse of the filibuster to continue. We have to change the way we do business. We have to govern. It is time for us to pay attention to jobs and the economy. and the things that matter to American families, the things they talk about around the kitchen table. That was the message that was sent us from this election, and we would do very well to listen to it. Under the abuse of the current rules, all it takes to filibuster is one senator picking up the phone. That's it. Doesn't even have to go to the floor and defend it. Just a phone call by one senator. No muss, no fuss, no inconvenience, except for the American public. Except for a nation that expects and needs government that works. A government that actually works together and finds common ground. Maybe some of my colleagues believe that the Senate is working as it should, that everything is fine. Well, Mr. President, we do not take that view. It isn't working, and it needs change. The American people of all persuasions want a government that actually gets something done. The challenges are too great, the stakes are too high for a government of gridlock to continue. And Mr. President, I would ask consent. The New York Times today and several of the local newspapers in my home state have editorialized about moving forward with reform and how important that is. And I would ask consent to put those in the record.
Without objection.
And let me just recognize I have three of my colleagues here on the floor that are senators who have just been elected. And I think one of the best things about this new class of senators who are coming into the United States Senate is they've studied this issue. They understand this issue. They've been out there with the American people and listened to them. And the American people are demanding change. And so it's a real pleasure to see today on the floor and the presiding officer, the senator from Hawaii, the senator from North Dakota, and also the senator from Maine. And I know that shortly we'll be going into our caucus and having a very lively debate about which way to move forward, how we do reform. I'm convinced we are going to reform these rules. I hope we do it, working with our colleagues on the other side of the aisle. But if they will not come with us, we are in a position where we're in the majority and we have to make this institution work for the American people. And with that, I would note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.